Well, hi everyone. This is Scott King over at Zimperium, and thank you so much for attending our webinar today, Securing Our Mobile Banking App, What I Knew, Discovered, and Still Can't Believe. So I am joined with Julian Hall, and Julian is the Senior Vice President of Enterprise Architecture and Application Development at Security Service Federal Credit Union. And I'm going to be talking with Julian and answering your questions. So if you have a question during the presentation today, of course, ask it in the Q&A window and we'll get to those as appropriate, sometimes in the middle and many times at the end. But a little bit about what we're going to talk about today is some of Julian's research on when he was looking into his digital channel, what available data he found, what discussion groups he found, what he didn't find, a little bit about the landscape and more specifically a mobile threat landscape. And then we are going to touch on kind of what this is going to look like post-COVID. So after our coronavirus culture, right? What's the new normal going to look like? And some recommendations on maybe where you can look for some updated information, and then we'll take questions from the audience. But first, Julian, I just want to learn a little bit more about you, who you are, how you got here, and so everybody, please welcome Julian. Julian, how are you?
Good morning, Scott. Thank you. I'm doing well and appreciate the chance to share my experiences with folks. A bit about me. I'm the Senior Vice President, Enterprise Architecture and Application Development over at Security Service Federal Credit Union, the best credit union in America. And I've been in the software industry now for 30 years. I started out as an IBM developer in England. I was working on the internals of CICS, the big online transaction processor, and had the privilege of working in the restructure of the security domains in that world. It got me involved in security from a long time ago. And from there, in IBM, I branched out into doing worldwide consultancy, mainly in financial institutions. And I moved on to Siebel Systems for a while in their Financial Services Global Competency Center. And then I was the operations architect for e-commerce at USAA for about 5 years. And then I've been now working at Security Service Federal Credit Union for the last 13 years. And I've had the honor and privilege of being able to grow all of the application development teams and the initiatives that we've done across practically every line of business process that we support. So I've lived through quite a lot of change over the industry over the years. I've seen things evolve from like home banking, proprietary client-based account access, internet banking, mobile banking, wearables and voice, and those kinds of technologies. So that's a little bit about me.
Yeah, you've seen quite the evolution, and you've probably been in and out of different economic situations like we find ourselves in today. And interesting that you said something about your first mobile banking client. I remember actually getting an update to the mobile banking client in the mail. It came on 5 of those 3.5-inch floppy disks, and I update those. Yeah. And so that was before browsers, I guess. But that was interesting. But curious, I wanted, as you went through your evolution and your current research on what you were doing when re-architecting your digital channel, can you explain to us some of the things that you learned, maybe some surprises? What happened? What did you learn?
Sure. Yeah. It's always been the case that the industry has been changing. Obviously, there's been some radical revolutions that have gone on over the last 30 years. And so I've been used to seeing change happen and seeing how things come together. One of the things that was a little different in looking at things on the digital platform world was how the industry was changing faster than the ecosystem of participants. And what I mean by that is that there's a whole different array of participants, from mobile banking providers to security firms to vendors to utility tool providers, and all kinds of supportive things for operational maturity and other parts of it. And it wasn't really an even distribution of how people were keeping pace with the changes. And I kind of liken it to how it's not a good parallel, but I mean, today's world, you've got the internal combustion cars and you've got electric cars, and some things stay the same and keep pace, and some things are radically outdated. Like, we all need tires, we all need steering wheels and dashboards and windows, but things are different, when you start looking at motors and the kind of mechanics underneath, batteries and gearboxes and transmissions. Those kinds of things are all evolving, and the distribution of vendors and the services, it was patchy as to how much they were all kind of covering the total space of like digital channels. And some of the information was not easy to understand whether or not there was a full assessment of the different aspects, not because of any kind of any desire to mislead or hide or suppress. I felt that it was just the speed of change, the speed of emergence of different parts of the digital self-service world meant that not everyone really was up to date in having a complete picture of all different aspects of the digital banking world.
And then when you say everyone, when you say everyone, who, can you put some boundaries on that? Because I'm kind of curious if this is people producing solutions or people looking for solutions.
I think there's both. In the on the one side, people looking for solutions were challenged in and still are in knowing what are the right questions, in what are the right kinds of areas to start to go deeper into things. Like, here's an example: is that going back, I can remember like 15 years ago when the first kind of ideas around mobile banking were starting to be formed, and when we started to kind of go towards actual solutions out there, there was some assumptions out there around, okay, well, there's only so much you can do. The platform device provider won't let you touch this part of it. I know iOS is kind of another a big example of artificial enclaves that were drawn around what was the purview of how you worked or how you thought about your mobile banking solution. And over time, that kind of assumption kind of got baked in, but a number of folks have, I think, started to realize that that's not allowable. That's not permissible in this day and age, is that you can't make assumptions anymore like that about the trusted nature of the platform which you're running in. And you have to therefore take a deeper look at what's going on. Now, here's a good example. It's one of the litmus tests that I've been using on some of these areas, is that I've asked a question about jailbreaking devices. And when you get back the answer, you can kind of get an idea about how well someone or an institution or vendor is thinking about that. 10 years ago, an answer might have come back and said, well, yes, we checked the jailbreaking. Well, in this day and age, that question needs to be answered much more deeply, because you need to understand how the devices are protected against jailbreaking, what kinds of checks are going on. Because the bad guys are always adapting what it means to jailbreak a phone, and they have different mechanisms on how they hide what they're doing, flipping that backwards and forwards. And so you get an idea about the maturity of people talking in the mobile space when jailbreaking and what you do and how deeply you think about the types of jailbreaking, the ways that it's deceived, and the ways in which the bad guys are basically using that to hide what they're doing. It's one of the tests that we've been using to evaluate just a general sense of when you're dealing with different participants in the mobile banking space. We've been looking at other areas even beyond that. For instance, going deeper into the trusted nature of the clients, the devices that we have, is kind of shown that there is a space that is really becoming more established as a category now for folks. What I mean by this, runtime application self-protection and client-side detection. Those kind of acronyms now are starting to gain traction with regard to being able to look at those things in a more critical way and be able to evaluate exactly what's going on that device and figure out what you can do to protect yourself against those kinds of threats like malware or other kinds of activity that's going on. And you really have to take charge of your own analysis and evaluation of the things that are important to you, because there isn't a complete picture. Gartner helped us out with being able to point out some of the areas to look at, but I really advise that folks need to be cognizant of their own needs, their own risks, and to go out and from that and look at many different sources and review different perspectives to find out what kind of status we're at in that particular part of protection and security and capability, and to do it frequently because it is evolving and it is changing.
Yeah, it changes quite rapidly, and it's, you know, as a vendor, it seems, you know, us trying to keep up with it is really a full-time job, with the research teams, with the malware teams, our labs teams, and then all the sales and engineering teams. You know, we do try and keep up with it, and we get questions from customers and prospects and partners almost immediately when something comes out new on, you know, how does this work? What is really happening? Help us understand this. So so there is a thirst for knowledge out there, and it is difficult to keep up, especially, you know, if you're fighting all these other you know, fraudulent campaigns and malwares on all your other digital channels. But so Julian, I'm kind of interested in you know, why you initiated your research. You know, you explained about the evolution, but you had kind of a, you know, a renewed interest in what you called the end client and talking about malware. Was there a specific mandate, or was there some type of event that initiated your project? Do you recall anything like that?
Yes, absolutely. There was some, not that long ago, there was a piece of malware that came to our attention called Anubis, and I started to read in a little bit of this, and I was fairly dismissive about, well, what is this thing? What is going on? And yeah, what does that mean for us? And I wasn't really giving it too much attention until I started reading through and understanding what was going on. And I was starting to get more and more of an epiphany here about just how much effort and research was going on with the bad actors of the world. And seeing the effort that was going on this malware to target specific financial institutions, to tailor it, adapt it, and to do some sneaky things like waiting until the accelerometer was telling you that someone was moving around for it to then wake up and start transmitting information. And this kind of side-by-side app world where a rogue app was basically pretending to be something, but in actual fact was harvesting information or doing other malicious things, started to open the door about just how much other stuff was out there and what was going on. And it then started to put further questions in mind to say, well, if there is this kind of inter-app kind of ecosystem that's evolving here, isn't there something that we can do better? Isn't there something that we can do more proactively around this? What can we do to insulate as much as we can our membership from any of this kind of activity that's going on? And so that's what got us looking more closely at the whole platform of the devices that were out there on Android and on the Apple world. Started to ask questions about, well, what can we deduce, what can we know about the environment that our applications sit within, so as to be able to get an even finer focus on what is the level of trust that we can have on the applications that are there. And so that was kind of one of our key drivers, really, as to why we started to look more closely here at, okay, well, there's this newer threat, this maturing world that's happening here in this space, and that other assumptions around what you could rely on the integrity around even the iOS framework were now questions that we needed to take a more serious look at, because evidently it was being proved that there was things going on in the even in the Apple world that were things that we didn't think were necessarily going on or allowed to go on in that world.
Yeah, it's I think the innovation amongst the hackers and anybody repackaging app, or especially tailoring an attack for a specific credit union or a specific bank or a specific payment type of activity or app, is it should really open your eyes on what kind of time people are investing in that, because maybe we're lazy, maybe we don't understand kind of the threat, but I think the threats are actually becoming more prevalent now that we're all at home in this coronavirus situation. I know that we've talked about COVID-19 and kind of what happens afterward, but now that you can read, there are more than 60,000 domains that are COVID related or coronavirus related, trying to phish us. There's all type of these apps that are being packaged to look at our locations, and maybe we have some concerns about that. But how does this coronavirus situation change us? How does it change your credit union employees? How does it change your remote self-service, your digital channels? What do you think we're going to see after this?
I think that we're likely to see an acceleration of the trends that have been already happening with regard to cybercrime. One of the things that's interesting that I've seen some reports around rather anecdotally is how crime has radically reduced in the COVID world. Well, the bad guys are in self-isolation as well. And so, yeah, there's many different types of crime that are not happening as much: fraud, theft, robbery, and they're just harder to enact out when the population isn't around, and they're concerned for their own safeties as well. And so the criminals, though, are still looking for their income streams, and it is possible that may force them to start looking at other kinds of avenues of malicious activity. And it wouldn't surprise me then if some of that then means that those bad actors now diverted into the e-commerce fraud world, card not present fraud, ID theft, and account takeovers. And it is known how in the dark web there are even facilities created for people who don't have strong technology skills still to be able to exploit and buy actions that are damaging for potential fraud or other malicious activity out there. And I think that with more people who then looking at that kind of channel to be able to enact out whatever kind of malicious activity are going on, there's going to be more skills, there's going to be more market, more demand, more investment in that world, which is why I do think that that's a reason I say that I think that the trends that are going on today may get accelerated by having that extra kind of participation or that demand in that kind of market space. And then when we look at this from the other side of the coin, is that from our membership's point of view, there's a shift now in their perceptions of how they're conducting their transactions. The drive for more self-service is very much alive. Yes, having certain amounts of services on our platforms is good, but now in the post-COVID world, people are going to say, well, I want to do more. I don't want to have to go out. I want to be able to do more and more of these kinds of transactions. And so that's going to drive more services onto the e-commerce platforms, in online banking, in financial industry platforms. And I think that that's going to mean that the level of security, the whole trust that you are trying to understand that's going on when someone is interacting with you on your online services, that needs to also to be reviewed and more attention paid as to what is the trust that you've actually got, which links back to what I said about bringing trust into focus, and doing so meaning you're taking a wider viewpoint, additional layers as to what makes up the whole perception of what you deal as the level of trust you're associating with this actor interacting with your site. And even people working more remotely, I think, is another driver here. We're going to have more people working from home. And so that's going to introduce more attack vectors for the bad guys to use through the home networks and the other equipment that's now potentially available. So that even with all these different things, that even if it is just a small increase of what's going on, it definitely is a point where organizations need to pay attention and start to think really carefully about what is the totality of all of the different security layers that they have in place for what they're doing now, but also what they may now need to do in the future as a result of the change in habits that the post-COVID-19 world is bringing on to us.
Yeah, I'd like to take a look at at what happens to everyone's backlog with new services being demanded by customers, and then maybe what they're not going to develop, right? What falls off of the backlog, or what just keeps getting pushed back. So that'll be that'll be interesting to check in on about 6 to 9 months. But Julian, you explained when you were doing all your renewed research. You said that some information was difficult to find or unavailable or not readily accessible. Can you explain a little bit about what you were looking for and maybe why it was difficult?
Yes, one of the things that's difficult to find was consistency of the information. We were really looking for comprehensive, unbiased, matured, current, honest advice about the state of services in a digital channel. And it was very much a case of a hodgepodge of information that was all over the place. Some of it was contradictory, some of it was like-minded, but some of it was isolated. And it was very obvious that you really had to plot your own course through the information as of today. And so it meant that really what you needed to do was to be able to have a iterative approach through all of the information that was out there to get many different kinds of reads of what was going on, of what was possible, what was the emerging picture of what you can do. Like, for instance, on the Anubis world, the question came back from that, all right, it's horrific what's going on, all right, but is it alone? Okay, well, what does that mean? How many other kinds of malware are there? How advanced are they? How quickly are they changing? What kinds of protections are available? What are other people doing? How pervasive are these things? That information was very difficult to come by, and it meant that you're really having to make some informed deductions around the state of what you could actually do, what kinds of things were possible. And, that was very illuminating for us in saying, well, no, there's things that we can do. There are mechanisms out there. There are some capabilities that have evolved that really give us then another chance to be able to have a better understanding as to what's going on, what the overall context of the other processes and activity that's going on a device relative to when, say, an online banking type of transaction is going on. And so that was really important for us too, and a bit of a breakthrough really, and we're understanding, okay, no, there are things that we can do and we should be doing, and so that was hard to get to, quite frankly, as it's saying that no, this is emerging, this is possible, this is a road that is now becoming much more of a road more traveled, as far as like what people need to just bake in as another layer to the way that they approach their overall position around securing their applications.
Yeah, it's it's definitely evolving quickly, and I think we'll find more and more information available, especially when people do things like this. So really appreciate you sitting down with me today. It's been great. But so what are you going to do now? So you've done this research. What are you going to do differently with your digital channels and mobile experiences, and maybe some of the services that are coming online, in the next months?
Well, the key things I think is taking a closer look at how we think about trust and how we think about risk in those kinds of environments, and it will inform what we do with regard to capabilities that are available, and adjusting policies that are much more reflective of the level of trust that we have going on. It is a set of ingredients that has to go on looking at what you've achieved with authentication, well, the device assurance that you have, and then the limits of the activity and the types of service, the expansion that you may be looking at with the things that you put on. And so those are all going to be things that we will look at differently, and we'll be then taking a closer idea at what that means for types of members, the kinds of things that we're allowing them, the amount of things that are going on, the frequency, the velocity of the things that are happening, for us to then be able to say, okay, yeah, no, this is something we look at, or something that we review, or something that we decline. But I think overall that this is going to be definitely a change as far as like our perception or our thought process on the actual device itself.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, and I do have a question from the audience based on your last answer. I had a question come in about, what are some key mechanisms or any mechanisms and controls that modern mobile banking apps should have implemented? So I think maybe we can talk about, at a minimum, what they should have implemented, and maybe at a maximum. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean it's a very broad area on looking at these things. I think that one of the guidances that came out a long time ago, and it's still true today, is all around from the FFIEC when it was talking about layered security, and has other kinds of names like defense in depth on different areas. And I think that's one of the key areas that continues here, but maybe with now an expansion on the different kinds of layers, looking out in front beyond your own organization with regard to what are other actors doing, good and bad, looking at your enrollment process, looking at authentication, how you're authorizing different transactions, the administration and monitoring that's going on, and then auditing is also important in our financial world. As far as the controls that are put in place, there are obviously different dimensions to what controls the kinds of services that are out there, and every financial institution's got their own tolerance to different risk, and it's got their own kinds of profiles that they associate with different kinds of activity, not just on the nature of the member or the client or customer that's coming in, but also on the context of how it's being conducted, where it's come from, any other kind of frequency of activity that's going on, then the amount if it's transactional based. And so the organization defines then what is going to be appropriate risk based on the level of trust and the kinds of service and other kinds of profile attributes that may be associated with someone. So it's a very open-ended kind of question, and there are many different facets to it. But I think that one of the things that really does stick out, though, is organizing well and planning well, so that you end up with a clear and transparent way in which you have categorized and set down, if you like, your matrix of the kinds of people, kinds of devices, all the different dimensions that make up your particular viewpoint of the activity that's coming to you based on the nature of your business. And from there, being able to define out what are the appropriate controls, limits, or other kinds of actions that you take on things, and making it clear that it spans across different channels as well. So just thinking about it for mobile is one, but really for the sake of sanity and organization, it really makes most sense to look at those business rules in a way that is organized centrally, so that you can get very good and collaborative information across all areas of your organization to be able to understand what kind of capabilities are allowed in one channel versus another channel versus this actor versus this other attribute of whatever is being presented. And that, I think, would be a very important part of considering how you manage the controls that you set up.
Yeah, I definitely have some views on that, since as Imperium, this is what we do. But if anybody's interested, we do have some banking research on what protections about 100 mobile banking apps actually have in there, and what they lack, and how they fail for pass or fail for compliance reasons. But we'll send that out. It's really interesting. It's quite surprising on how many mobile banking applications don't have lots of protections. Some of our customers have actually been very surprised at kind of the health of their their mobile endpoints amongst their customer base on how bad the devices really are. So we've got some research available that I'll send out. But I got one last question for you, Julian, and this came early on in the webinar, but this viewer asked, how do you resist pressure if the business wants to run financial app on a jailbroken or rooted device? So when you were talking about jailbreak detection, you know, a lot of times, you know, we don't want to use that device because of permission reasons for other apps, right? But the business still wants to run a certain app on this jailbroken or rooted devices. And I guess this viewer is pushing back. Like, any guidance on how he can push back or state that, hey, this is not a good idea.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and it's I think a realistic question that comes up. Looking at this kind of position, you have to think about what is the worst case scenario of what can happen. And that means understanding, you know, what are the kinds of ways that your app can be used, what kinds of services are offering, if there is live money transactions, big dollar transactions, if there are significant kinds of things going on that could be damaging for the organization reputation-wise, or from other kinds of threats that could potentially go on. I think that there's various different things that you know, should be pointed out, and it really comes down to outlining the kinds of risk and exposure that there may be on these different things. And it can be a little bit uncomfortable conversation sometimes, because you know, maybe going to point out some things of your own organization that may need to have extra investment in. So, for instance, it may be that, okay, if we're going to allow a particular capability to get opened up on a jailbroken device, then we need to invest more in monitoring. We need to invest in people who are going to be able to look at this activity and review this more. We're maybe going to limit the amount of functionality that we have to do, or we're going to put other kinds of controls in place, like step-up authentication that goes on to evaluate if this is another level of authentication that's needed. Maybe there's extra authentication that's required. And I think it really comes down to a case of helping the business understand what the exposure is that they could be opening up, but then also providing the alternatives around the extra reinforcements that could be invested in that would help to mitigate some of those things, and also provide capabilities to be able to, say, potentially suppress or even turn off any functionality that starts to show signs of compromising the organization. So it is a challenge that we as technologists always face, but we're here to support the business. And ultimately, it's a case of educating the business sometimes on the kind of risk and the worst case scenario and the probabilities and likelihood in an objective way, and then presenting those kinds of investments that potentially could help mitigate what's going on. And then ultimately, it's going to be left more as a business decision. I found quite often that once people have a bit of an understanding about what they're asking for and the consequences, that they then start to realize, and then sometimes, you know, you need other organizational help as well. Risk management groups or other kinds of control groups within organizations can also provide that kind of input. So ultimately, it's a collective decision on the organization as to whether or not they would allow some or all activity on devices that they can't necessarily guarantee are behaving in the full mode of integrity.
Yeah, it sounds like what you talked about earlier with, you know, all the variabilities, and just understand, you know, your trust and what risk you're able to take on. And, you know, if someone starts to abuse that trust, do you have a control or a monitor to remediate? But that's all the time for questions that we have today. I want to make sure that everybody can get to their next meeting. If anyone has any further questions, Julian has asked us to not disclose any kind of information for privacy reasons, so I truly appreciate that. But if you have a question for Julian, you can email me at king@zimperium.com, and I will be sure and forward that over to Julian. But Julian, just want to thank you for spending time with me and our audience today. I really appreciate your insight.
You're very welcome. My pleasure, Scott. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Thank you so much for joining.